They said the colonel did it out of cruelty, not love. On a night heavy with thunder and shame, he gave his only daughter to the strongest slave on the estate, as punishment, or perhaps as a test. She returned months later, carrying life. But the man was never seen again. The year was 1854, and Red Hollow stood as one of Georgia's proudest plantations, a sprawling empire of cotton and bone. Its master, Colonel Beauregard Harlan, was a man carved from discipline and iron. He commanded men like cannons. His voice alone could silence a field. To his slaves, he was a god. To his daughter, Abigail, he was a wall she could never climb. Abigail Harlan had lived her entire life beneath that shadow. The townsfolk whispered cruelly about her. The colonel's burden, they called her. She was large, awkward, and painfully shy, with cheeks that flushed crimson at every glance. Her father treated her with the same cold precision he gave his troops. No softness, no affection, only command. Every evening the colonel would dine alone in the great hall beneath portraits of ancestors who never smiled. He drank bourbon like water, staring at the empty chair across from him, the one that had once belonged to Abigail's mother. She had died giving birth, and the colonel never forgave his child for surviving. Among the slaves, one man stood apart, Josiah. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a man whose silence carried more weight than words. The overseers called him the Bull. His back bore the scars of defiance, a testament to the many times he had refused to break. One humid summer night, after a bitter argument with his daughter, the colonel made a decision that would stain the Harlan name forever. In the presence of his overseer and a handful of terrified servants, he ordered Josiah brought to the main house. "You want to be a man?" he said, his voice slurred with bourbon and malice. "Then take what a man takes. She'll be your wife by morning." Abigail screamed. Josiah did not move. The candlelight flickered across his face, revealing something that wasn't fear, but pity. That night, thunder rolled across Red Hollow. Doors were locked, curtains were drawn, and somewhere within that great decaying mansion, the unthinkable began. When dawn broke, the colonel stood by his window, watching the fields shimmer in mist. Behind him, his daughter's cries echoed faintly through the halls. He thought he had proven his power, but he had just unleashed something he could never control. If justice refused to come for him, would you? Josiah had known pain his entire life. Pain was the rhythm of Red Hollow, the crack of the whip, the creak of the harness, the hiss of sweat falling into the soil. But he had also known restraint, the kind that comes from quiet strength. Every lash, every insult he bore in silence. His body healed, his spirit never bowed. He had been born on the plantation, the son of a blacksmith and a field hand. When his father was hanged for speaking out of turn, Josiah learned that silence was survival. By 30, he had become the strongest man in the county, not by choice, but by necessity. His back was the foundation upon which the colonel's fortune stood. The other slaves looked to him, not as a leader, but as a symbol of endurance. He had once lifted a broken wagon alone, saved a man from being crushed under the wheel. The overseers both feared and respected him. They called him Ironhide. The colonel, however, saw something else, a reminder that even chains have limits. When the colonel summoned Josiah to the great house that night, he expected punishment, not purpose. He was stripped of his shirt, marched through marble corridors that smelled of whiskey and candle wax, and thrown before the colonel's daughter, Abigail, trembling, weeping, wrapped in lace and shame. The order that followed was not a command of desire. It was a declaration of ownership. "You belong to me," the colonel said to Josiah, "and now she will too." The silence that followed was unbearable. The candles flickered as the storm outside reached its peak. Josiah looked at the woman before him, not as a prize, nor as a victim, but as another soul trapped in the colonel's cage. That night, what happened behind those doors remained buried beneath the screams and thunder. No one dared ask. No one dared speak. But come morning, Josiah's eyes were different. Something inside him had broken, or awakened. For days afterward, he refused to work. He ate nothing, spoke to no one. The overseer beat him until the whip tore his flesh open. Still, he said nothing. In the weeks that followed, the colonel's house grew quiet. Abigail stopped leaving her room. Josiah was sent back to the fields, and the whispers began. A slave had touched the bloodline of a Harlan, and somewhere in the silence the air began to change. If you were Josiah, would you have obeyed or burned the whole plantation to the ground? Abigail Harlan did not leave her room for 47 days. The curtains were drawn, the mirrors covered. Even the servants whispered outside her door, as if afraid the walls might listen. Her father's footsteps echoed in the halls, heavy and deliberate, but he never knocked. He had done what he believed was necessary, and he would not look back. In those long weeks, Abigail's reflection became her only company. She would stare into the glass, tracing the faint bruises that had blossomed on her skin, the marks of her father's cruelty disguised as righteousness. She tried to pray, but the words turned to dust before they reached her lips. Somewhere between guilt and grief, she began to lose her voice entirely. The housekeeper, Miss Ellery, brought her meals, untouched day after day. "You must eat, child," she'd plead softly through the door, but Abigail would only whisper, "Tell him I'm fine." She was not. Outside, the summer heat thickened, turning the air into syrup. The slaves in the fields spoke of strange sounds at night. Weeping carried on the wind, a woman's voice that seemed to rise from the cotton rows. Some said it was the colonel's wife's spirit, mourning the daughter she could no longer protect. Others said it was Abigail herself, crying in her sleep. One morning, Miss Ellery found the door unlocked for the first time. Inside, Abigail sat by the window, pale and hollow-eyed, staring out at the fields where Josiah labored under the burning sun. Her hand rested on her stomach. "Miss Abby," Ellery whispered, her voice trembling, "what has he done to you?" Abigail turned. Slowly, for the first time, her eyes met the old woman's. "He gave me something," she said quietly, "and he will take it away when he finds out." That night, she began writing letters. To no one in particular, perhaps to God, perhaps to the man she could not name aloud. Pages filled with ink and tears, hidden beneath the floorboards. The colonel, sensing her defiance, grew colder. He forbade the slaves from entering the house and ordered Josiah chained at night. "She will forget," he told his overseer. "She must." But Abigail did not forget. She watched the fields every day, eyes fixed on the man who had been forced into her life and then ripped away. Something inside her began to shift. Not hatred, not fear, but an awakening. If silence were your only weapon, would you use it to survive or to destroy? By autumn, the whispers had reached the town. Red Hollow's reputation, once synonymous with power and respect, began to curdle into rumor. The merchants in Augusta stopped tipping their hats when the colonel passed. The pastor hesitated when he saw the Harlan family in church, his gaze drifting toward Abigail's swelling figure. Colonel Beauregard Harlan, a man who had built his legacy on control, felt that control slipping through his fingers like sand. Each passing day brought another quiet humiliation, another reminder that the fortress of fear he had built was now cracking from within. He tried to hide her. The windows were shuttered, the servants forbidden to speak her name. Yet secrets on plantations were like roots. They spread underground, unseen, until they broke the surface. Abigail's pregnancy became the unspoken scandal of Red Hollow. In taverns, men muttered over whiskey, each telling the story a little differently, that she had been seduced, that she had lost her mind, that the colonel himself had lost his faith. But only the slaves whispered the truth, that the colonel had made a deal with sin and was now paying the price. At night, he drank alone on the veranda, staring into the fields where torches burned faintly like dying stars. He thought of his dead wife, of her soft voice, her kindness, how she would have looked at him now, this broken god of a man, drowning in bourbon and guilt. He called for Josiah once, demanding he be brought to the house, But when the overseer went to fetch him, the man hesitated. "Sir," he said quietly, "you don't want to see him?" Josiah had changed. His silence was no longer submission, it was judgment. His muscles trembled from exhaustion, but his eyes, those calm, unreadable eyes, no longer looked away. The colonel ordered the whip. 50 lashes. Not for rebellion, but for memory. Each strike echoed through the valley, through the walls of the mansion, into Abigail's trembling hands as she pressed them against her belly. When it was done, Josiah was left chained in the old barn. The colonel returned to his bourbon, his face pale beneath the flickering lantern light. For the first time he saw shadows where there should have been none. That night, the wind howled across the fields, carrying a voice that was not human, a sound like the earth itself crying out. And in the morning, the colonel found a message carved into the barn door. It read, "You cannot bury what you created. If your shame began speaking to you in the dark, would you listen or go mad?" The barn sat at the far edge of Red Hollow, half swallowed by kudzu, its beams warped from years of humidity and neglect. It was where broken tools were left to rot, where sick mules went to die. And now it was where Josiah was kept. He had not spoken since the whipping. His back was a ruin of torn flesh and dried blood, each lash a brand of his master's hatred. The overseer had chained him by the wrists, binding him to a beam so that he could neither sit nor sleep without agony. For days, he hung there in silence, breathing through cracked lips, waiting for death to take him. But death did not come. At night, the barn came alive. The rats scurried along the rafters. The wind slipped through the slats, carrying with it the faint smell of magnolia and decay. And sometimes, in the hour before dawn, he could hear footsteps outside, light and hesitant. The first night it happened, he thought it was the overseer checking the locks. But then a whisper reached him through the boards. "Josiah," it said, trembling. "Are you awake?" It was Abigail. He turned his head toward the sound, disbelief washing over his pain. "You should not be here," he rasped. "I had to see you," she whispered. "He says you are a beast, but you are not." For nights afterward, she returned, bringing scraps of food, bits of linen for his wounds. She spoke softly, telling him of her nightmares, her fears, the life growing inside her that she did not understand. In those dark hours, something fragile began to take shape between them. Not love, perhaps, but recognition. Two souls bound by the cruelty of one man. The slaves began to notice changes. The colonel grew restless, his temper shorter. He sensed something he could not name, a stirring beneath his order. When a field hand mentioned seeing a lantern flicker by the barn at night, the colonel's bourbon slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The next evening, he went himself. Rifle in hand, lantern blazing, he stepped into the barn. The chains hung empty. The floor was slick with blood, but no body remained. Only the sound of iron swaying in the darkness, slow, rhythmic, like breathing. And from somewhere outside, a woman's scream pierced the night. When the lantern fell, its flame revealed the word carved into the beam where Josiah had hung: freedom. If vengeance wore a human face, would you recognize it before it was too late? The storm rolled in from the coast like a living thing. By dusk, the skies above Red Hollow were black and heaving, swollen with rain that smelled of iron and smoke. Lightning clawed across the horizon, illuminating the cotton fields in brief, violent flashes, like ghosts caught mid-scream. Inside the mansion, the colonel paced the great hall, his boots echoing against the marble floor. Every candle trembled in its holder. He had sent riders in every direction, to the fields, to the river, even to the swamps. But Josiah was gone. The chains had been broken, not cut, torn apart as if by a force no man should possess. Abigail sat in her room, her hands shaking as she folded a blood-stained cloth. The storm outside seemed to answer the storm within her chest. She could still hear her father shouting in the courtyard hours earlier. The word escaped, falling from his lips like a curse. But she knew the truth. Josiah had not escaped. He had been released. The slaves in the quarters whispered of a shadow moving through the rain, tall and silent, walking toward the main house. Some said they saw him by the fields, his figure outlined in lightning. Others swore they saw nothing at all, only the torches extinguish one by one, as if the night itself were swallowing them whole. By midnight the wind was shrieking through the shutters. The colonel loaded his rifle with shaking hands, muttering scripture under his breath. He ordered the doors barred, the servants awake. No one dared move. Then came the first sound. A slow, heavy knock on the front door. 3 times. Deliberate. Human. "Who's there?" The colonel barked, his voice cracking. No answer. Only the low groan of thunder rolling across the hills. He turned to his overseer. "Open it." The man hesitated, then obeyed. The door swung open with a crash, letting in a gust of wind and rain, but no one stood there. Only the smell of wet earth, and something else, something metallic. When the lightning flashed, they saw it, a trail of bloody footprints leading from the steps toward the stables. Bare feet. The colonel's face went white. He turned to his men, but the words died in his throat. Outside, beneath the thunder, came a sound that froze them all. A low, rhythmic breathing, too close, too steady to be the wind. And from the darkness beyond the porch, 2 eyes stared back, calm, unblinking, and waiting. If the storm itself came for your sins, would you hide behind walls or face it? When the lightning split the sky again, the colonel finally saw him. Josiah stood at the edge of the porch, soaked, bloodied, bare-chested, the rain glistening across the scars that mapped his body like scripture. The chains that once bound him now hung from his wrists like ornaments of judgment. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. The overseer, trembling beside the door, whispered, "Sir, he ain't alive. He can't be." The colonel lifted his rifle. "He's flesh," he hissed, though his own voice betrayed doubt. Josiah took 1 step forward, slow and deliberate. The boards creaked beneath his weight, his eyes, dark, unwavering, locked onto the colonel's. And for the first time in his life, Beauregard Harlan felt something colder than fear, recognition. Lightning flashed again, revealing Abigail at the top of the staircase, her nightgown ghostly white against the darkness. She gasped, clutching the railing as she saw him. The man her father called monster, the man who had been chained for her sin and his cruelty. "Josiah," she whispered. Her father turned sharply. "Back to your room," he thundered, but she didn't move. Her voice broke through the storm. "He came back for me." The colonel's rifle wavered. For a moment his hand trembled, and in that moment of hesitation the wind howled through the hall, extinguishing every candle at once. Darkness swallowed them. The gun fired, a flash, a scream, then silence. When the light returned, the overseer was on the floor, his throat torn open by splintered wood. The rifle lay empty. The colonel stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Josiah stood at the threshold, unmoving. His expression was not rage. It was peace. "Why?" the colonel rasped, voice weak. "After all I've done to you, why not finish it?" Josiah looked past him, to Abigail, trembling at the stairs. "Because she still carries my blood," he said softly. Thunder rolled again. The doors blew open and the wind surged through the hall, scattering papers, candles, memories. When the colonel looked up again, Josiah was gone, vanished into the rain like a spirit released. Abigail descended slowly, her eyes hollow, her body trembling. She knelt beside her father, who was weeping now, silently. "He's gone," she said. "No," the colonel whispered, his voice breaking. "He's still here, and he will take everything." Outside, the wind began to whisper through the trees, the faint sound of chains dragging through the mud. If the man you destroyed came back not for revenge, but for justice, would you still call him a monster? Winter came early that year. Red Hollow lay beneath a veil of mist and frost, the once vibrant fields reduced to pale skeletons of cotton and ice. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and pride, now stood hollow, its windows dark, its halls echoing only with silence and memory. Abigail's child was born on a night without stars. No wind, no sound, only the low hum of crickets that seemed to pause when the baby took its first breath. Miss Ellery delivered it in secret, her old hands trembling as she cut the cord. When she lifted the child toward the candlelight, she gasped. The baby's skin was the color of bronze, neither white nor black, but something in between. Its eyes, though newborn, were startlingly calm. They did not cry, they only stared. Abigail held her son to her chest and felt both peace and terror. She named him Samuel, a name she whispered so quietly it seemed meant only for heaven to hear. The colonel refused to look at the child. For weeks he locked himself in his study, drinking through the nights. The servants said they could hear him talking to someone, low, frantic mutterings behind closed doors. Sometimes a second voice would answer, though no one ever entered or left. When he finally emerged, he ordered that the baby be kept out of sight. "He will not bear my name," he declared. "He is neither mine nor hers. He is a curse." But curses have a way of growing. As Samuel grew, strange things began to happen. The animals grew restless when he passed. Candles would flicker when he entered a room, though there was no breeze. Once a mirror shattered as the colonel tried to look at him. Abigail said it was coincidence, but Miss Ellery whispered otherwise. "He's got both their blood in him," she told Abigail one night. "Strength and sorrow mixed together." Such things don't fade easy. By the boy's third year, the colonel's health began to fail. His hands shook, his mind wandered. He swore he saw Josiah's shadow at the edge of the fields, watching, waiting. No one else could see it, but everyone felt it. Sometimes Samuel would stand at the window at night, staring into the rain. When Abigail asked what he saw, he would point to the trees and say, "The man who hums to me." Her blood ran cold. "What does he say, my love?" The child smiled faintly. "He says he's coming." Back when the house forgets his name, and outside, in the stillness of the frost, the wind began to hum. If the sins of two souls could create one who remembers both, would you call him cursed or chosen? By the spring of 1858, Red Hollow had changed beyond recognition. The fields lay untended, the workers silent, the great mansion dim and cold. The laughter and music that once filled its halls were gone, replaced by whispers, strange sounds, and a smell of damp earth that no fire could chase away. The colonel had become a ghost in his own home. His hair had gone white, his hands trembled without cease. He refused to step outside after sunset. The servant said he kept his lamps burning all night, terrified that if he closed his eyes, the darkness would remember him. Abigail now lived mostly in the nursery with Samuel. Her beauty had faded into something fragile and haunted, her smile a memory she no longer wore. She read to her son every night by candlelight, old hymns, psalms, anything that might keep the shadows at bay. But the shadows were listening. It began with footsteps in the attic, heavy, deliberate, pacing above them at night. Then came the sound of chains dragging across the floors, slow and rhythmic, echoing through the walls even when no one was there. The slaves whispered of Josiah's spirit, restless and near. They said he could not rest because his body had never been found. They said he was waiting, not for revenge, but for acknowledgement, for the truth. One evening, as thunder gathered once again on the horizon, Miss Ellery found the colonel in his study, staring at an old map of the plantation. "It's the soil," he muttered. "It remembers." He pointed toward the northern grove, the place where the magnolias grew thick and white. "That's where I buried him," he said, his eyes unfocused. But he wouldn't stay buried. That night, the air grew still, unnaturally still. The servants awoke to the sound of Samuel crying for the first time in months. When Abigail rushed into his room, she froze. The window was open, and on the floor lay a trail of mud leading to the crib. Samuel was unharmed, but beside him lay something impossible. An old, rusted shackle, its chain snapped in half. The colonel collapsed when he saw it. He whispered Josiah's name once, then began to laugh. a low, cracked laugh that turned into sobbing. From that night on, he no longer spoke. He sat by the window each day, staring toward the northern grove, waiting for the storm that never came. But the house had begun to breathe again, softly, heavily, as if something beneath its foundations had finally woken. If the ground beneath your home began to remember every sin ever buried in it, would you dare stay another night? The storm came back to Red Hollow as if summoned by the dead. Thunder rolled over the hills like cannon fire, rattling the windows and shaking the old bones of the house. Every light flickered. Every door creaked open as if pulled by invisible hands. Colonel Beauregard Harlan sat in his chair before the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket, his eyes glassy and hollow. He hadn't spoken in weeks, yet tonight, he whispered, a name over and over, Josiah. The servants had all fled. Only Miss Ellery and Abigail remained. Samuel slept upstairs, though even in his dreams he murmured and turned, as if he too could hear the storm calling his blood. At midnight, the front door slammed open. The fire dimmed to embers. A rush of cold air swept through the hall, carrying with it the smell of rain and iron. Abigail ran from the nursery, her candle trembling in her hand. "Father?" she called. "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer. He was staring into the darkness beyond the doorway, and there, framed by lightning, stood Josiah. His figure was as solid as any man's, yet water dripped from him, as if he had risen from the ground itself. His eyes gleamed with sorrow, not rage. When he stepped forward, the floorboards groaned under his weight, each step echoing with the weight of years and unspoken truth. "Why?" the colonel whispered. His voice was that of a dying man, cracked and small. "I gave you everything you needed to live." Josiah stopped. "You gave me chains," he said softly. "And when I broke them, you buried me in silence." Lightning flared again. For a moment, Abigail saw them both, her father pale and trembling, and Josiah, drenched and unbroken, two men bound by the same sin. Samuel began crying upstairs, a high, piercing wail that cut through the storm. The wind rose, howling through the rafters. The portraits on the wall shook loose, falling and shattering on the floor. Abigail turned to run, but Josiah's voice stopped her. "He cannot harm you anymore," he said gently. "But you must let the house remember." The colonel's hand shook violently. He tried to lift his rifle, but his heart betrayed him before his finger could pull the trigger. He fell forward, clutching his chest, gasping once, then silence. Josiah looked down at him with something close to pity. "Now the land can rest," he murmured. When Abigail looked up again, he was gone. Only the rain remained, washing away the last traces of blood from the old wooden floor. But in the nursery, Samuel had stopped crying. He was standing by the window, staring out into the storm. "Is he gone, Mama?" he asked softly. Abigail trembled. "Yes," she whispered. The child shook his head slowly. "No, he's part of the rain now." If the sins of a man could return as a storm, would you pray for it to pass or to wash you clean? Morning came slow to Red Hollow, pale and quiet, as though the earth itself feared to wake. The storm had passed, leaving the fields drowned in fog. Trees bent low under the weight of rain, and the air smelled of ash, mud, and something faintly metallic, the scent of blood long since spilled but never forgotten. The colonel was buried beneath the magnolia grove, the same place he had once tried to hide Josiah's body. There was no preacher, no sermon, no mourners, only Abigail, Miss Ellery, and the child. The ground was soft from the rain, swallowing the coffin as if reclaiming what was always its own. As the final shovelful of earth fell, Abigail felt a strange stillness settle around her, not peace, but acceptance. For years the land had suffered beneath her father's cruelty. Now it seemed to breathe again. But the house was not silent. In the days that followed, the servants who returned spoke of whispers in the hall at night, voices reciting scripture backward, the soft clinking of chains echoing through the walls. Sometimes they swore they saw a tall shadow moving along. The veranda just before dawn, pausing where the colonel's chair used to sit. Abigail never confirmed what she heard. She simply nodded and told them to keep the lamps burning after dark. Samuel grew quickly, but he was unlike any child she'd known. He spent his days wandering the fields, touching the earth as if listening to it. He rarely smiled. At night he would wake and stand by the window, humming the same tune the field. Hans once sang, a song Josiah used to lead before sunrise. One evening, when he was 6, Abigail found him standing barefoot in the magnolia grove. The fog coiled around his small frame like smoke. He looked up at her and said, "Mama, the ground talks to me." She knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "What does it say?" He hesitated, his eyes distant, as if hearing something beyond her reach. "It says it's done being angry," he whispered. "It just wants to rest." And then, as the last light of day faded, a soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it a low, steady hum. The same tune Josiah once sang, now woven into the wind, the soil, the breath of Red Hollow itself. Abigail wept, not from sorrow, but from release. The land had remembered, and, at last, forgiven. But long after she and her son left that place, the people of Georgia still swore that when storms rolled through those hills, you could hear the sound of chains, softly keeping time with the rain. If the earth beneath your feet could remember every cruelty and every act of mercy, what story would it tell about you?